Hi everybody, Colin Stevenson here, joined by my hero, John Lenhart. Hi John.
Hi.
Today we're talking about trauma and childhood trauma specifically. Over the last, especially the last 5 years, I've seen a massive push on it, and it goes into people's behaviours and their traits and why they're doing what they're doing, why they can't seem to move forward, and all of this kind of childhood trauma is being brought up. And I do find it's very important that we embrace that and that we allow to work ourselves past it and through it. But John, you have got a certain way that you work with people. And I would like, before we go into the discussion for myself, I'd like you to talk to us a little bit about it first, please.
Right. So like you said, the last 5 years, what's happened is people have talked about this ACE test, this adverse childhood experience test.
Yep.
There's 10 questions. People take the test and it's basically 10 traumas. Did you have a parent who did this? Or did you experience this? And you get a score from 0 to 10. Studies have shown the higher your score, the more likely you're going to have certain issues. And that's great. But the correlation is really light. And I like to say, if I expressed a correlation to the same extent that ACE test does, people would not pay attention. It's just that there seems to be nothing to help us with this childhood trauma, that they embrace this. One of the biggest issues with the ACE test is everybody is different. Everybody handles their trauma differently. Some people remember their trauma, some don't. Some traumas are worse for people than others. Everybody is unique. So Colin, I bet you can guess what I'm going to apply to this model to make it actually all make sense.
Yes, the intangible drivers model.
Exactly. So what I have found over, I'm going to say the last 10 years, is there's a very strong correlation to the wellness. Some people call it resiliency. I have a different definition for resiliency. But when you look at how well people are coping with their childhood trauma, whatever you want to call that measure, I have had a model, a 3-part model that seems to make it all make sense. And I want to explain it. In order to understand this, you might want to brush up on the intangible drivers. We did a great video with Dr. Ellie Harper, psychologist, who she explained why this is a benefit. And part of the reason is she's using what I'm about to talk about to actually help people. This is why I think this should be a part of psychology. It could actually help people intentionally.
Yeah.
So the 3 parts of the model, the first part is the trauma. And again, some people experience tremendous trauma. Some people experience light levels of trauma, but we all experience trauma.
Yes, we do.
So the first thing to realize is, what kind of trauma did this person experience? I think everybody would agree with that model. And that's really what the ACE test does. It's just, what kind of trauma did they experience, but it has to be this big one. I'd like to open it up to everything. And then I'd like to look at 2 more terms. The second term is, what is the intangible driver of the individual?
Yeah.
If the individual is forward, so if the individual is exhorter server, they're going to zip right over their trauma. You're not even going to know that this person had this tremendous trauma in their childhood because they're very forward. If they're backwards, perceiver, teacher, I executive coached a woman successful woman, and I think I've shared this story before, administrator server. Her ACE score was 6 or 7. She had 4 sisters. Their ACE scores were 6 or 7. That's a tremendous amount. This woman, everybody would say, is doing great. Administrator server, forward. She had another sister who's doing very well, server. Another sister was kind of struggling, compassion server, 1 foot forward, 1 foot back. One sister who was in therapy, compassion perceiver, and one sister who was institutionalized, perceiver teacher. Your intangible driver is going to affect how you process your trauma. There's the third term, the intangible driver of your role model adult. So what that means is, that doesn't necessarily have to be, like for me, that doesn't necessarily have to be my dad. If I only had my mom, it could be my mom. If I had a grandpa, but there's a role model adult. And what happens is every child looks to some adult unconsciously 160 and tries to emulate that adult because they think that's what it is to grow up. Mm-hmm. When the person is floating around at the 160, they start acting like that adult. My dad is teacher perceiver. I'm administrator teacher. When I get a little riled up, I start acting like my dad. I start perceiving like crazy. That's how you know I'm at 160. My son is administrator server, very forward. He hates teaching, but when he gets riled up, he will teach and knock you right down. And people are always shocked where it come from. He's acting like his dad. You see spouses do that. They say, I didn't marry your mom, I married you, but you're acting like your mom because they're at 160. That role model adult's the third term, meaning if you think about it, someone could have a light level of trauma. They could be forward, exhorter server, and they could have a perceiver or a perceiver teacher dad, and they don't seem to handle things well at all.
Yeah.
Someone could have a lot of trauma, be very forward, exhorter server, or have a lot of trauma and be backwards, perceiver teacher, and have a parent who's compassion server. And they don't seem to have a problem at all. There's three terms to this. So when we look at people, how they deal with their childhood trauma, we need to take into account their intangible driver, and we need to take into account the intangible driver of their role model adult.
So role model being the person that they look up to the most in terms of their training and their nurturing.
In terms of trying to be an adult.
Okay.
So, who you looked up to, who did you unconsciously try to be in order to be an adult?
That makes a lot of sense. And that's why I turn into my mum and why my mum and myself clash when things get heated, because I turn into her and it's like, don't fight with the monster that you created type thing. But now, obviously, since myself going through the intangible driver side of things, it's like I am then able to work to my intangible driver and allow myself to gain energy when these situations would normally be heated. It wouldn't stop my mum from not acting the way she would normally act, but it would change the end outcome because I will change it. And then because she's used to me saying A, or her saying A and me saying B, and it's always very, if I come in and say C or D, she's not expecting that. So again, it's like, well, where do we go from here? And you get a different kind of tension, shall we say, but it's a tension that can be easily dissolved because it's not coming to loggerheads.
Right. So I'm not going to go through all the steps we take to help people with this, but I'm going to mention one exercise that we use in Instant Impact really early on in the lesson. And what we do is we have the person identify their intangible drivers, identify the intangible drivers of the role model adult. And then we have these three questions. And we say, what is something your role model adult did that everybody ought to do? What's something your role model adult did that nobody should do? And right there, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get the person to not say the role model adult was perfect or useless. I think I've told the story before. I have a friend of mine who's perceiver. He will hang out, with people and talk, and he'll even sit in a bar with a guy and talk, and he'll ask them about what's what some of your dad did, another guy that no dad should do, what's something your dad did that every dad should do. And by the time the guy's done, he's crying. Because what happens is one of the toughest things that block people's ability to get over their childhood trauma is they think their role model adult is perfect, or they think the role model adult's useless. Then the third question is really where we tease this out and help them get their own identity. What's something that would be right for your role model adult to do that wouldn't be right for you? Now, when you answer that question, you've gone, okay, this behavior, when I get tweaky, that behavior is not me, that's my dad. And I reckon when it's happening, I'm going, that's my dad. And now I don't get sucked into that, and I know what I'm doing. So those 3 questions help tease that out, which is one of the very first steps. There's a bunch more steps, and I want to talk about the overview of how we help people. But that is important, Colin, is those 2 terms get overlapped. What's your intangible drivers or your uniqueness? What's the uniqueness of your role model adult? Because they play into how you processed your trauma.
I totally feel this. And this, again, you and I haven't had this full conversation before. So everything that we do is very off the cuff, spontaneous. So it's just in my head's turning here at a rate of knots, thinking about, because I do have a good, relationship with my mother, and we do get on, but it's when we clash, I turn into her. And because I'm the younger one, and it's me, I've got to bring myself back consciously into my uniqueness, back into my kind of flow again, like consciously make the effort to know and then get myself back into that flow position that I'm able to dissolve and change the situation. And I've got these secrets. It's great. I'm going to go and write these down once we finish this, because that's a massive factor for anybody.
Right. So how we do this, and you just said dissolve, and we've talked about generativity. So you and I have talked about this. I believe that people's childhood trauma can be the thing that launches them out into the everything there's meant to be. I don't believe that childhood trauma is something that prevents you from being what you ought to be. I believe it can launch you, and that we call that generativity. There's 3 parts to generativity. And I like to use this. I've been talking to Dr. Ellie Harper about this because I'm helping her use this when she's dealing with people and their interactions with their spouses, their kids, or their parents or their friends. And so I have these 3 measures that I measure every interaction, because self-esteem is what we're shooting for, and mental health is always grown by interacting with others in their uniqueness.
Yeah.
So the way to fix all of this is not isolation, it's interaction. So I have these 3 measures for how I look at interactions. So the first measure is sharing. We did a whole video on this. We'll get the link to it. We talked about the levels of intimacy, interaction, connection, relationship, friendship, marriage.
Yeah.
So that, I like to say 10 points a piece. Like if you're at interaction, it's a +10. If you're at connection, it's a +20. That's the amount of energy you're getting. So where are you? When I look at 2 people interacting, I'm like, where are they at? And I say, there's this many points. The second thing is abuse. Abuse is how much we drain or take energy away, and we all abuse each other. The measure for that's the communication guidelines. We've done a whole video on that. I am not perfect at using the communication guidelines. Even though I intend to be nice to you, Colin, when I don't use the communication guidelines, it's a -2 or 5 from you.
Yep.
And so that's where I'm taking from you. If I'm yelling and screaming, it can be a lot more than 50+. I could scream at you to a -60. And then the third step is repair, and that is generativity. It's taking the abuse and turning it into a plus. So let me go through a couple of analogies here of how I like a couple of situations when I'm looking at people. So these 2 people are connection at work. That's a 20, but they yell and scream at each other at a -30. Well, they're going to be at -10 very quickly. If they get away from each other for a while, that 20 comes back, and now they can interact again and so you see these people go, we just need a time apart. Okay, your sharing level is not more than your abuse level.
Yeah.
I already know that. So you're not going to go anywhere with that. 40s, people are friends and they abuse each other. Well, how come when I abuse them, they get mad, but I abuse this person that way and they don't get mad or whatever? It's like, well, you're only at connection with this person. You're at friendship with this person. You're at 40 and you're abusing them 30. So you're staying at 10. And the energy between you is a +10. That's not, 100, but it's a +10 at least. It's something versus you can't treat everybody. So when you see people going, you can't treat this person that way. Why not? I treat everybody like that. Well, if your sharing isn't up above your abuse level, you can do it if your sharing's up there. Now we got the case where somebody is if you think about it, their relationship, family and friends are at 30, and they yell, scream, boss them around. They think they know them. That's the minus 50. A lot of people are in this situation where they're sitting here at this, I'm friends or family, I'm going to say, when I say friends, I mean people you go to school with. People you go to school with think they know you. Your relatives think they know you. So they talk to you and they project on you. They negate you. They do a minus 50 all the time. What? We're family. I've known them. It doesn't matter. And they just negate you. So 30 minus 50 is a minus 20. So this person, when they hang out with their family, they're at minus 20. Now notice, there's no repair here. What I'll do with this person is I will sit down with them and the person who's doing the minus 50, and I will go through the steps of repair. We did a whole video on the 7 steps of repair. When we repair that minus 50 becomes a plus 50. So the 30 plus 50 is 80. They went from a minus 20 to an 80. That's 100 difference, or a whole person different.
Yeah.
I have a history of working with people and people saying that person's a completely different person. And the thought sometimes is maybe I hypnotized them, or I'm a cult leader, because only a cult can get that type of, response that quickly. I am telling you how it's done. It's this person learned repair. They took their trauma, their abuse, and they turned it into sharing a repair, and it makes you into this plus 80 person. The secret to all this trauma, the secret to us achieving happiness is stepping into the attention of the abuse in order to repair it. And that's how you become this completely different person.
Yeah, and I would just like to touch on as well, while we're talking about this subject, for the last 5 years, as we discussed at the beginning, people have been brought up, so now they feel that they're a victim of their trauma and they don't really see the way out. Now, I watch a lot of coaches, I watch a lot of psychologists. Psychologists, psychiatrists, they tend not to be able to give advice moving forward, so they sit and listen. But every time they're listening, this person becomes more and more of the trauma that they experienced, and it actually builds on them. So if you can imagine rolling a snowball and then pushing it down the hill, it becomes bigger and bigger. So every week these people are coming back. As much as they get methods for the effect of their behaviors, the trauma becomes more and it snowballs. So what I believe is needed is process, and I also believe for people to understand their own intangible drivers of them, and exactly, their guardian that you were speaking about, because once they realize that they're different from who they were being brought up by, they can then become into themselves. Once they understand their own unique intangible drivers, they're not their trauma anymore. They've got something they can grow. They can live their life and gain energy and be a plus 80, plus 100 every single day, because they know that they can do things intentionally. And I feel, because a lot of people intentionally hold on to that trauma for their bad behavior, their place of safety, the excuse for not doing things in life is because they don't know how to do it on purpose. And this is why you and I have come together, and it's to allow people to flow in purpose, to be happy in purpose, to change in purpose. All the things that they're scared to do because of their past. And it really makes it a beautiful, beautiful just experience to be able to watch that. And that's not a selfish thing from me. It's just because we get to see them bloom into this kind of, the flower just comes in.
Right. And so this is the last thing I'm going to say. Again, we could talk about this for hours, because when you have this model I have, you can diagnose everything you just talked about. These psychologists don't have the repair step. That's why we did our psychology series. So there's no way to turn that trauma into a plus. The best they're going to do is help people get out of a hole. And if you think about it, now what are they working on? They're working on the sharing and the abuse. What they can do is they can try to minimize the abuse and lessen it and lessen it and lessen it. But that was the thing that ought to have springboarded them up to something more. But if they don't really address the abuse, so they're doing a resolve, they don't really address it. Like you said, the abuse comes back. And when it comes back, it becomes bigger because they thought it was gone. Or they tell these people don't interact with these other people. Well, now they've limited the sharing. They've cut the sharing component out. So now these people are going to isolate and sit in their abuse.
Yeah.
What ought to happen is if this person, and then the third step, what you said was, if the psychologist doesn't understand intangible drivers, they can abuse the patient by saying sentences that go against the patient's intangible drivers. Yeah. That's a form of abuse. If I talk to you like you're an exhorter, Colin, it's abuse. It's going to cause you to trigger. So that's another step. So does the caregiver understand that some of their words, their sentences are abusing the patient? Talking against their intangible drivers is abusing the patient. There's two other causes of abuse, not just the trauma in the person's life. The ideal situation would be to talk that person in a way that you can truly help them put their arms around their trauma. They understand their uniqueness. You know how to talk to them that way in a safe way. Then you give them the tools for them to repair that trauma. And then you give them the tools to be able to interact with that person and grow the level of sharing. Yeah. And now all of a sudden it's possible to help that person get to 100. It's all of those aspects. Like I said, there's all these permutations and everything. I just wanted to line out a model, but it covers every situation, every time a person, this is how I've helped psychologists, therapists, and counselors for the last 15 years, is they bring a situation to me and this is the model I'm computing in my head. And then it tells me what aspect to work on, and they get results every single time.
Yeah, because they dissolve and don't resolve. And that's the most important part of any situation that's challenging, is to dissolve the challenge to get to where you want, or flow to get and challenge to get the end product. It's remarkable how people are pushing each other further into their trauma, and coaches and therapists are pushing people further into their trauma. Oh, get to the root, get to the depth, get to that place at the bottom of your belly and sit with it. No, come out, show yourself, be you, and start to gain energy moving forward. And it's not going to be there. You know, it's like it's happened. It'll turn into, and I like to talk to people about a trigger and an experience. They're both the same situation, but it's two different ways to look at it. So once they've met it, they've come out and they've done their bit for their gaining energy due to their intangible drivers. It's an experience. But while they're still in there, it's a trigger. So any word, any television program, any society movement, trigger. That person's never going to be happy. Whereas when they get it out, they write it down or they accept it. So even when we do the bit where they write it down on the paper, it's enough to accept a little bit of it. It's more than holding it on to yourself. And, and allowing yourself to be at that kind of 360, 320, 120, 320, 160 stage where you're holding on so tight, which allows that bit of release, and then they can make the interactions after it. So,
right. So this will summarize all of our videos, really. What are most executive coaches? What's their intangible driver?
Exhorter.
So they got over their trauma by exhorting themselves over it.
Yeah.
They really didn't get over it, and they're still dealing with it, but they just keep exhorting themselves over it, going forward over it. And their strategy to everybody else is, let me get you forward over it. If that other person's not an exhorter, you're hurting that person. If that person's an exhorter, you look like you're helping them, but you're hurting them in the long term. And this that's why executive coaches are all these exhorters, because it worked for me. I exhorted myself past it. Let's exhort you past it.
Yeah, and just one last thing to touch on that. If you've got we spoke about it earlier about an immature and a mature exhorter, why? If you've got an immature exhorter, why? Trying to coach somebody else, it's like, well, this happened to me, and they don't care about how their client's feeling. They care about how they feel, and they exhort onto them rather than help them forward. So it becomes dangerous. And then when you get a mature exhorter of a couple of people we spoke about earlier, they show you that they want you to feel how much they care. Right. But it doesn't always mean that what they're doing is going to do, because they're still maybe holding on to theirs a little bit as well. So we can maybe go on to that another time, and we can talk about doing that, because that would make an interesting video for people. But thank you for for today. Absolutely magical. And I hope people, again, can reach out to yourself or anyone at Flowcess or myself if they want to discuss anything to get out of childhood trauma, because we can save the world, John. Nobody else has this information, so I welcome them all, and so do you. So thank you so much, and I'll speak to you soon. Take care.
Bye.